Welcome to the show. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. So Counterpoint is not the only show on the network. Of course, you knew that. One other show that is going to be launching is called Canadian Justice. And joining me today in studio is KR Davidson, host of Canadian Justice. KR, thank you so much for joining me. I'm happy to have you here as one of the new hosts. And what are Canadians going to be interested in when it comes to justice, and what do you hope to do with your new show?
Well, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate being able to have a conversation with you. Canadian Justice, it's a very interesting show. I'm a lawyer, but I think the premise of the show is how do we bring these big legal issues that are facing Canadians and bring it down so that the Canadian population as a whole can understand that we have lots of issues with respect to freedom of expression, academic freedoms in play, democracy, the whole 9 yards. And so it's a real question of how do we bring it out to this place where we can distill it, allow Canadians to be able to dialogue and enter into some of this discussion. We're seeing a massive change come through various bills through either federally or provincially, and then throw on top of course, a lot of the shifts as a result of COVID-19 and what's coming into play. And so there's a lot to try to keep up on. Our team's having just a good time trying to pick out what are those subjects that are most salient, and then how do we get them down into a place where we can really engage in dialogue on them.
And we talk about laws, and of course our legislation comes from within Parliament. We have 338 members of Parliament who are supposed to be our voice in Ottawa in the House of Commons. It's called the House of Commons. We're commoners. We are supposed to be represented there by our MP. But sometimes I feel like that doesn't happen exactly, and maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit more in the show. But in COVID, you're right, things have been happening so quickly that the lay Canadian just cannot keep up, let alone even scratch the surface of what's happened. And I think people would be shocked to see some of the, to have their eyes open to see what kind of legislation has passed and what exactly has been happening in the last several months.
Yeah, and there's a combination. There's a lot that's happening through the courts as well. And if there's a decision that's made in the appellate court, we're seeing that that's going to have a shift on the next 10 or 15 years with respect to how we interact. But I think even greater than that is the whole concept of justice and what that entails. Sometimes we narrow that too much just to the concept of the courts, but the reality is how do we treat our neighbor? How do we interact? How do we operate as citizens is part of how we view things through a lens of justice. So it's a big question, and I think we're going to have lots of fun with it. There's no lack of topics for us to cover off, that's for sure.
No, definitely not. And since, speaking of justice, of course, we just see the climate in our neighbors south of the border and here in Canada, in the United States and Canada, where we see a lot of protesting, some even rioting. There's a lot of unrest and a lot of demands for justice for one cause or another. Finding out what the layman thinks of what justice means and how it actually is applied through courts, through the parliamentary system, through the American, through Congress. I think it's really, people are really seeking this term justice and wanting to find out what exactly this means and how it's going to apply to them.
Yeah, and it gets tied hand in hand with the concept of purpose, and people are, especially when you're taking a look at, I can remember when I was in my 20s and I had great ideas, and but if they were all implemented, it probably would have been challenging. I'm glad that there were some checks on my ideas at the time, but that idealism is a beautiful thing, and even when we take a look at the protests, it's a manifestation of our freedom of expression, but we're always dealing with a balancing act. How much do we want to see change versus what are some of the benefits of the structure and the stability that we have? And this is a continued dialogue that we have to have as a nation as a whole. We want to make sure that it's balanced, that everybody's able to come to the table. And this is really what our Parliament is about, our parliamentary democracy, is that the citizens can shape how the country's moving forward.
And I can see your eyes light up when you speak of democracy and freedom and justice. So I think you're the perfect host for this show. You're a lawyer. Is that what perhaps that thirst for those freedoms and justice what drew you to that profession?
Well, it's funny. I was a police officer for 10 years, and so I think in my early days I looked at things a little bit more in a black and white perspective, and I loved that concept of being able to give back. And then when I moved into becoming a lawyer, you look at things in everything's a little bit more gray. But you start to understand that you can make a change, and that's the nice part. It's one of the things that we want to draw out from the show, is that people can make a change. And the question is, how do you dive into these solutions? Like, I don't think that the answers are instant. I think you have to contemplate, what you're dealing with, and then how do we band together to be able to have a solution? I think that sometimes we want to be past just having a line, and how do we have a solution? How do we move together in cooperation? To me, that's the heart of justice.
Well, perhaps we'll discuss that a little bit after we come back from this break. Stick around. Welcome back. I'm joined here in studio with KR Davidson, host of Canadian Justice, one of the other programs here on the News Forum Network. KR, we were talking before the break about Canadian democracy. And I know, I studied political science in university, and I remember being keenly aware of how our democracy functions. But I've seen a shift in the last couple decades, let alone through many decades. How has democracy changed in Canada?
Well, I think that there's been a fundamental shift in 1982 when we had the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. And I think probably the biggest shift that we saw there is that it allowed the judiciary, the courts, to be able to come in and to put a check on the government in particular areas. But what we've seen is this huge uptick in this concept called judicial review, which is just basically if there's a challenge with what the government's doing, the courts can review that. So there's been there's been a big shift in power to the courts, and so then there's always a question: is that exactly the thing that we intended it to be? And we're getting a lot of decisions that are coming out as a result of what the courts are deciding, and probably a little bit less than what Parliament has been deciding previous to 1982.
Which, again, it's the House of Commons. Really, that's our voice in the House. We're the ones who should be making the laws, and the judges should just interpret them. Am I correct of that interpretation?
In some sense, the Constitution in 1982 was to say we needed to have some sort of check so that the government, whether it's through legislature or otherwise, would not compromise these fundamental freedoms. But there's been a real question as of late of whether the courts are starting to go into this place of even expanding the charter in a way that maybe the original founders didn't identify with. So these are real questions that are out there right now. We're actually seeing these competing freedoms, whether it's equality, freedom of expression, freedom of religion. And previously the courts would read that as them playing together nicely. But now it seems like there's a shifting where there's some thought that there might be a hierarchy of rights, and that's causing a lot of new questions.
So who decides in that hierarchy? Are we seeing the judges, or do we have judicial activism? Is that what's going on?
Well, this is a good question to ask, because we do have what's called interveners, which means groups across the country can come and ask to come before the court and be able to make argument on particular issues. I think we have to be cognizant of any intervention in that, and we see that in politics as well.
Right.
But the other thing that we need to take a look at is sometimes the facts of a court case are specific to that case, and it doesn't apply to everything that would be applicable to Canadians as a whole. So is that the best way to do that? I think sometimes we always have to rethink where we're at and go, how much have we usurped from our role of Parliament over to the courts because it's easier? It might not be the best long-term solution. So I think there's always questions in that area.
And I think, again, because we're so close, we share such a large border with our neighbors to the south, the United States, we see how their justice system works, and then kind of compared to ours, they have a lot of elected judges. All of ours are appointed in the provincial courts, the superior courts, et cetera, and then, of course, our Supreme Court. Do you think that we would ever shift to more elected judges, or do you think having the appointed judges is an okay, good thing? Like, there are appropriate checks with that process?
We've definitely seen some shifts under the previous governments where there's more scrutiny with respect to the appointments that are in play. I don't know if we would move to the elected model in the states. That they seem like they like to elect everything. The sheriff.
They elect the sheriff.
Yeah, that's right. And so I don't know if that's the case. And we have a different form of government. There's a lot more checks in the states than what we have here in Canada. You're not just going to pass something through the House that might not get through the Senate. You're seeing this real struggle within their particular houses.
And in the committee level too, a lot of back and forth
Exactly. And so Canada doesn't have that sort of rigor with respect to the parliamentary system. However, the parliamentary system is just a fundamental component, and I think we are seeing a little bit of erosion of the strength of Parliament, and I think we should concern ourselves with that.
Yes, and hopefully after the next commercial break, I want to definitely delve into the erosion of Parliament in the time of COVID. But just to wrap up your thoughts on our system vis-a-vis the American system. I've mentioned this before, we have a faster moving democracy.
Yes.
I feel that we pass way more legislation, or it's factually correct, we do, than our American counterparts. Are we able to maybe keep up with the times faster or respect our democracy more adeptly than Americans?
Well, it's just the structure of our government. Our government permits that. If you have a majority government, you're able to pass particular legislation, and one of the challenges that can come with that, great things can come by way of progress, but we can also see that ideological stances can be advanced by way of a particular government that may not be conducive of the population as a whole. Right. I think that those are challenging. I don't think that we want to have certain items or issues politicized, but they are, and so I think we have to be cautious of that.
Well, we're going to talk about COVID right after we come back for this break, so stick around. Welcome back. We're having an interesting discussion on Canadian Justice, which is the name of the show of my guest, KR Davidson. You are the host of Canadian Justice here on the Newsforum Network. So before the break, I said I wanted to discuss COVID, and I know a lot of people are sick of the COVID, but it's this important issue, and more importantly is how has the climate around COVID how has it impacted democracy at the federal level? What's our government been doing during this time?
Well, I think, of course, we've seen shifts in every area, whether it's the business, but specifically in our parliamentary system, we've seen a huge shift. Of course, we shut down Parliament almost immediately. We did have a little bit of rigor right before we shut it down, and specifically on CERB. And we actually saw some great things back and forth within, even the Conservatives and the NDP came to the table, and we saw some assistance for small business, and we saw the real benefits of the parliamentary system. Even at a reduced level, because there were only about 10 from each party meeting, or some small percentage. Yeah, and this is right before they shut everything down, and then after that we saw things really scale down. But I think one of the challenges is, and it's no different, the court systems have been trying to eagerly move forward, and it's tough because we're sort of entrenched in certain ways of doing things. But I think one of the challenges that we had with our parliamentary system is we were really running everything out of the executive and making massive decisions, and Parliament really wasn't participating in some of these things. So we're seeing spending that it's beyond our imagination. Like we're beyond anything we've seen in history. Sure, we're shooting out numbers, and I don't even think we understand the gravity of the numbers that we're speaking about. Like I think before we went into COVID, I think we were running into a deficit of about $29 billion. We're taking a look at 10 times that amount coming out of COVID, a debt of $1 trillion, and like these are astronomical figures. But one of the real challenges is we don't have the legislature there as a check on government right now. Right. And even when we took a look at the return, it was really minimized. We're not seeing the ability for private member bills to come out, which we know is a spark for the media to be able to hold the government into account. So I think that there's some real challenges. I think that there's a bit of erosion in our democracy, and we really want to make sure that that's not something that stays for a long time. No, I agree. And I mean, I'm going to ask you this question. I don't even know if you can answer it, but why haven't they met? Why did Justin Trudeau, in a sense, pro-Parliament? Why haven't they been meeting so reduced? I've seen countries all over Europe who are meeting, yes, social distance, yes, wearing the masks, but they're still meeting together. They make it work. Why has this Prime Minister not done that? Well, I don't know the answer to that one, but what I will say is it's our responsibility as the citizens of the country to be able to make sure that we even keep the government in check. And so I think even at the level of the media has to say, here, this is not acceptable, and there needs to be a pushback. It's not just the Liberals that do this. Stephen Harper did this, but when Stephen Harper prorogued for 2 months, he was lambasted. And that was right before the election. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in fact, he did it quite tactically. Yes. But you saw academia come into play, you saw media come into play, and they really took issue with this.
I think they took the edge off the Conservatives, like what they thought was an advantage of proroguing a Parliament before an election. They said, actually, you're turning your back on your Conservative principles by doing this.
Yeah, and the Conservatives are weakening democracy.
Yes, so, it was terrible.
And so it's not just the Liberals alone, but it is a serious issue for Canadians. And Canadians should, I think a lot of times Canadians look at what happens in Parliament and they go, I wonder how much is really happening. But the reality is it's the spark for the media and the academic world to come into play to really have this checks and balances across our country. And I think that's a great thing.
I agree. And like, I am personally appalled that the government has been meeting on such a limited basis. You know, we have children who are concerned they're out of school, or they're not meeting with their friends, they're not going to their courses. We have people laid off work, people are furloughed. People don't know if their job will be there when all this COVID is over, if and when it's over. And yet here we have, you know, members of Parliament being paid, you know, a very good salary, more than most Canadians get paid, and yet they're not able to do their job, whether it's forcibly or voluntarily. I find it appalling. I think that they should be there, and Canadians should expect that their government will sit there and advocate for them.
Yeah, and I actually think that the Conservatives and the NDP have to step up in this respect. I'm pretty certain the Conservatives would like to still be sitting. I don't think that the NDP should have acquiesced so easily. When we take a look at the majority of seats are resting with the minority parties, we're dealing with a time whereby we've got a $1 trillion debt. Our credit rating just dropped with one of the providers. And we're in this place where we have serious questions that need to be answered. And so we need to be in this place where we're dealing with this. It's not just going to affect Conservatives, it's going to affect everyone.
Well, we're going to talk about how COVID has impacted democracy at the provincial level when we return from this break. Stick around. Welcome back to Counterpoint. I'm joined by KR Davidson here in studio. He's host of the show Canadian Justice. Before the break, we were discussing democracy at the federal level, but I feel that most Canadians really feel the impacts when erosions of democracy and justice and those kinds of measures happen at the provincial level. So tell me, have you seen some erosions in this country? I know I have, especially in Alberta and Ontario.
Yeah, you know, throwing on my lawyer hat, the reason is our Constitution gives most of the powers to the provinces, and so I think we feel it more concertedly at the provincial level, but we've clearly seen some actions from some of our provincial governments that are, I guess, questionable. Ontario has operated under the Emergency Management Act, and so we saw every province had a lot of shift in responding to COVID, and I know that there seemed to be an extension of how much we could do in Ontario. There's been a check on that now. But Alberta, I think, is probably the most concerning when we're taking a look at a democratic erosion, Bill 10 specifically. And
I find that shocking. And I did a quick video from home show when we were locked out of our studios for COVID with someone, a lawyer. And I found it shocking. I remember mentioning to him, I said, I find this shocking because, you know, here you have a Conservative premier in Alberta with a very healthy majority. Did he really need to give himself this much power? Am I alone in that sentiment?
Well, and I think if we take a look at it, it's what precedent do we set? And I return the why. Why do we need to be doing these things? And where is our value with respect to democracy? I find, even as the host of Canadian Justice, I'm trying to ask this question: how do we break down this concept of democracy down to something in a bite-sized level so people can understand the fundamental importance with it, that we need to be able to keep having a voice, that we need to be able to have accountability, and that's a benefit to be able to have that. So some of the challenges with Bill 10 is that they can delegate things to a subcommittee, everything's in camera, which means, you know, it's not open to the public.
Right.
Now, they say that expedites in decision-making, but what cost? And why have we had this for hundreds of years where it's open, and then all of a sudden we're finding that this is more expedient to do now? I think that there's real questions to have.
And I think the Canadian population is very trusting. especially in the time of a pandemic, something that most of us have never lived through before. And I think they give almost blindly this trust during this time to the government with the hopes that they will do the right thing. But now as things sort of loosen up and things are opening up, we are opening our eyes as well and saying, hey, that was an overstep. I don't think I like that. Why was I locked out of my church for so long? Why was this not an essential service?
Yeah, and again, that returns back to Parliament. Parliament should have been sitting already federally asking, did we close the border early enough? Or other questions like this. These aren't bad questions. They're actually great. They actually inform and make government better. It's the exact same way it works in our court system. When we have these great cases that go back and forth, we actually make things stronger all across the board. And so we shouldn't be afraid of the scrutiny, and I think that that's what we have to concern ourselves with. There's a sheltering on the scrutiny so that executive power can go out, but that's not our system. That's not foundationally what it's made up through the Constitution. And so we've got to be very wary when we start to see somebody step outside those bounds.
Right. And when we think post-COVID, because in the half a minute or so we have left, we're looking post-COVID. What does our democracy look like after that? Will we be able to get back to where we were, or is this kind of the new normal of how government will function?
Well, this is some of the challenges with Bill 10. There's no sunset clauses, and you're wondering, like, even under War Measures Acts and such, you had this period where when this happened, this would end. And so the question is, why do we have to confer this sort of power forever, basically, until that act changes to the executive? That it just seems to boggle my mind on how that could be the case.
Well, listen, KR, thank you so much for joining me. I found this discussion fascinating, and I look forward to watching more of your show, Canadian Justice, on the News Forum.
Hey, thanks very much, and it's great to be chatting with you.
I'm really glad that KR came by the studio today so we could chat about his show, Canadian Justice, because justice, freedoms, these are very important things when we talk about a functioning democracy. And now, in the time of COVID, it almost feels like that our democracy isn't functioning with various bills that have impeded on our civil liberties. Yes, in Alberta and in Ontario, but also across the country. It makes you wonder where we're actually headed with our democracy. We trust our governments to make decisions for us with our voice, but to make the decisions, especially in a time of crisis. But I can't help but think, with our parliament not sitting right now, will our voice actually ever be truly heard? An answer we have to revisit, hopefully, very soon. Thank you for joining me. This has been Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.